Tributes have been paid to Alex Salmond at his funeral as a leader who took Scotland so close to independence. The 69-year-old died from a heart attack in Macedonia earlier this month. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 66 points at 82.19. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.20. LBC weather, light rain for southern Scotland tonight, patchy mist and fog developing elsewhere overnight, and a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. On my panel tonight, to my left, Baroness Claire Fox, a non-affiliated peer who's the director of the Academy of Ideas think tank. Next to her is Richard Holden, the former Conservative Party chairman, who's Conservative MP for Basildon and Billericay. To my right, Josh Tapper, the former Gogglebox star turned Labour activist. He stood against Oliver Dowden in the general election in July. And Ben Lake is Plaid Cymru MP for Ceredigion, and he's the party spokesperson for the Treasury, Foreign Affairs and Science, Innovation and Technology. They are here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can WhatsApp on that number. You can text 84850. You can watch us on Global Player. And don't forget, if you miss any edition of Cross Question, you can catch up on the Global Player and also the Cross Question podcast, which is released at 11 o'clock on Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's start with a call from Jay in Willesden. Hello, Jay.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for taking my call and good evening to your panel. So just to give you a nice segue into cross questions from the last hour. There are lots of reports now that Israel is starting to use food as a weapon of war, which is obviously an international war crime. So my question is, how many more international laws does Israel need to break before the UK and indeed the wider world impose sanctions on it? And preferably answers without deflecting back to Hamas, because some of the international laws being broken, for example, illegal occupation in the West Bank, have nothing to do with Hamas.
Claire Fox.
So I don't actually think that Israel are using food as a weapon of war. I think the decision around UNRWA is undoubtedly contentious, but it's also the case that the distribution of food by the aid agencies has not been without complication, let's put it that way. And in fact, a lot of the trucks have gone through and have not been distributing food. There's also a problem with that particular aid agency in terms of its compromised position in terms of, I'm sorry to break the rule, but in terms of Hamas and their fact that they have, rather than being a neutral force, have been actually compromised in relation to the war and anti-Israel and so on and so forth. So I don't, one of the things that, there's loads of criticisms that can be made of Israel. I'm not suggesting that we all sit back and say, aren't they angels? But I think this accusation that they are starving the people of Gaza, which I've heard actually from almost the beginning of the occupation, is actually unmerited.
Well, they did actually prevent trucks from getting into Gaza for quite a substantial period of time.
Well, actually, they didn't
As did
prevent.
Egypt,
They
to be
didn't.
fair,
They didn't prevent any trucks getting in. And there was lots of trucks. I mean, in a visit to Israel, I went through to where the trucks were all loaded up, waiting to be taken away, and they were sitting there and they weren't being taken away. And we talked to, including, by the way, Palestinian aid agencies who said the problem is that the food is being hijacked by people on the way. It's being sold at exorbitant prices to the people of Gaza. It's just that the narrative that is very common here is to suggest that Israel are the bad guys, starving the people of Gaza, that nothing else is going wrong at all. And I'm just simply suggesting it's more complicated than that. And I don't want to get into a situation to give yet another excuse for the vicious, and I mean vicious, anti-Israel political rhetoric that we've heard in this country that's turned very quickly into, as we will know, a form of anti-Zionism that's anti-Jewish hatred. And I'm very anxious about that. So I would like us to have a calm discussion on this rather than just waiting for yet another excuse to stick the boot into Israel, which, after all, did not start this. And therefore, the conduct of the war has to be looked at in the context of how it started, what caused it, and the complications of the players involved, including aid agencies, which are not necessarily neutral in this conflict.
Now, I'm suspecting, Ben Lake, that you might have a different view to that.
I do. I take the points there about not wanting to oversimplify what is a complicated situation, but I don't think anybody would accuse the US government, for example, of being anti-Israel, and yet they've also expressed concerns about the level of aid entering into the Gaza Strip, particularly.
But so is our government.
And has the UK
And by the way,
government.
I wasn't suggesting that we shouldn't be concerned on that, just to be clear.
No. But I think the level of concern expressed by governments that have been very supportive of Israel and long-term allies of Israel, I think underline the reality that far too many people in Gaza are not receiving the aid, whether that be food supplies, sanitation, medicine, and indeed now shelter, that they deserve. And I think it is important to note that the government of Israel has a responsibility as occupying powers for much of the Gaza Strip to ensure that the civilians have access to food, sanitation, medicine and safe shelter. And I do think that unless the government of Israel ensures that there is proper and sufficient aid, then there will be further accusations that food or the control over access and lack of food is being used as a weapon of war, and that is against humanitarian law.
There are accusations made by one or two people in our phone in the last hour that Israel is conducting genocide by starvation.
I think we're at risk here. Unless the government of Israel has an opportunity here to disprove and allay those fears. The US government, in the letter they sent earlier this month, made it very clear that I think 30 days was the period of time that they set the government to show that this is not the case. If they fail, and the decision by the Knesset, which I think is important to distinguish, it is the parliament that's made this decision, UNRWA, leads us to believe, well, if you are not going to allow the largest humanitarian force in the area from proceeding and fulfilling its role and not presenting an imminent or clear alternative, then what are you actually doing to the people of Gaza? If you're not allowing the UNRWA in this case to deliver that aid, to deliver that food, and not presenting an alternative, I don't think we've heard any suggestions that the government of Israel is going to step into this breach, into this vacuum. And if so, I think it's very reasonable that people are concerned. And I read some of the reports by UN officials, and they are talking about fear of genocide and the possibility of it. And I think we need to be very, very clear, calm-headed, yes, about this situation, but also not be blind to the reality that's unfolding before our eyes.
Richard Holden.
Well, look, this is actually part of just something so much bigger. I think that's the other thing, that we can see individual incidents on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, I think, Claire's totally right. We need to ensure that aid gets through, as Ben has also said, and we all, I'm sure, across UK politics, want to see a peaceful solution in the end to this, with actually terrorist organisations not ending up running countries. But we have to zoom out a little bit more, because it's quite clear that Iran's proxies have done everything possible to destabilise the situation in the Middle East over the last year and a half, particularly. They were behind Hamas and the terrorist attacks in October. They've been behind Hezbollah and the situation which has left Israel having to move 60,000 of its citizens out of northern Israel. And that's all because of a broader thing, which was actually that Israel and the Arab world were slowly moving towards peace agreements in certain situations. It's in some of the Middle Eastern countries, and it was quite clear that was getting close between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so there is a much, much bigger context to all of this. That's not to say that the issues around ensuring that I want everybody to have food and medicine and water on the ground. We need to ensure that happens. But there's also been obviously concerns around UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. That's why we call it UNRWA, because it's such a mouthful otherwise. And the reason there's concern about it is because it's quite clear that there's some people who worked for UNRWA who were involved in the Gaza and the Hamas attacks. That's not to say that everybody who works for UNRWA is obviously a sympathiser with Hamas.
So isn't this decision by the Israeli Parliament rather over the top, given that I think only 10 of their employees have been dismissed for their action?
Well, 10 have been dismissed, but there have been much greater concerns that around up to 15-20% might be members of Hamas. Now, Hamas is a broader political organisation than it's not, but even within that, there have been concerns that hundreds of people who work for UNRWA, out of 12,000, admittedly, could be actually in the militant wing of it, and that UNRWA facilities have been used in the Gaza Strip. This is a really complex situation. I think what we all want to see is aid getting through. You've seen actually, it's sometimes when we talk about the Israeli Parliament, it might be, you might think, oh, well, this is a very multi-party system. This is not, massive blocks. They have a full PR system, and it's the fact that it's been overwhelmingly supported in the Knesset. I think we also need to remember these are proper left-wing anti-Netanyahu parties who will have supported, and Netanyahu.
That is interesting, isn't it? Because I think Likud have 64 seats in the Knesset, and 92 members of the Knesset voted in favour of this, so a lot of opposition.
I think only 10 didn't. This was an overwhelming vote. So I think we really need to be careful when we look at this, because there is such a big context here, and everybody, all of the actors around within the Middle East are playing for different reasons for their own political ends. And I think it's very difficult to zoom in on one specific incident and to be able to draw huge conclusions from it.
You mentioned the word actor there. A text here from Samuel says about your contribution, Ben, is this an Irish contributor? I really appreciate the Irish line on Palestine and Israel based on what I've read. Well, your constituency is probably about the nearest to the Republic of Ireland that we have. But let me tell you, Samuel, it's very proudly Welsh. Josh Tapper.
Thanks, Ian, and good to be here. Look, this is quite a personal issue for me. As a Jew myself, I get very concerned at the tone that this debate becomes sometimes. I've got many friends and family in Israel themselves, and Israel is one of the very few democracies in the Middle East. Lots of people with diverse political views. You've seen the protests out on the street on a weekly basis. And it's absolutely critical that aid does get into Gaza. There's no doubt about it. But this is a very complicated, nuanced topic. It's not black and white at all. And I very much doubt that sanctions on Israel will achieve the goals that the people who are calling for the sanctions so wish. UNRWA, as Richard actually pointed out, the reason why people have had their concerns about it in the first place are valid. Which is the involvement of some staff members in the October 7th attacks. We shouldn't tarnish the entirety of UNRWA with that brush, but this comes with context, and that context must be understood. And actions like sanctions, I think, really does concern me as an action to reel back on supporting a close ally and a strong ally and its right to defend itself.
As a British Jew, are you at all uncomfortable at some of the actions of the Israeli government? Because I remember I had Tzipi Hotovali, the Israeli ambassador, in for an interview, and I said to her, you don't half make it difficult sometimes for those of us who support Israel to do so the full-throated way that we like, because some of the actions of your government, of your Prime Minister, are just blatantly, it doesn't matter what side you're on, you can't support them.
I fundamentally disagree with Netanyahu and his government on a number of issues, and it quite frankly, angers me when you're trying to stand up for Israel as a beacon of hope and democracy in the Middle East. And unfortunately, Netanyahu's actions really, for me, oppose Israel's fundamental values over so many years upon which it was created and has developed over the last number of decades. So I do worry, I absolutely worry. And I, in order to get the hostages home and to put an end to this war, we do need a political peace process. And I wish that there was a leader in Israel who was willing for that peace and would sit down and have those conversations.
Do you ever see that or do you see that happening in the immediate future? Because I always think the Israeli electoral system mitigates against a sort of Obama-type figure. He had his weaknesses, but you kind of need someone like that on the Israeli side, and then a Mandela-type figure emerging from the Palestinian side, and I see little hope that either will ever happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, unfortunately, you don't see it happening anytime soon in the current state of things, but you have to have hope in order to get to that point, and you don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. So I long for that day, and I'm hopeful that it will come eventually.
Right, we'll move on to a different subject in just a few moments here on Cross Question. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
At Specsavers.
With Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Richard says, Ian, can you please identify the panellists? I have no idea who the last contributor was. Well, I did introduce him. His name's Josh Tapper. If you watch Gogglebox, you will remember Josh from Gogglebox. It was quite some years ago, though, now.
It was a long time, yeah. It was
how old were you when you started on it? About 14 or something?
I was 16 when I started. Before braces, sitting there in my pajamas on the couch. So very different time.
How did that affect you at school? Because I mean, either you would have got bullied or people would have treated you as a celebrity.
It was much more of the. I mean, people like the fact that there was this guy at school who was on the TV, and people kind of milked it really.
But you didn't, obviously.
I tried.
And you've since become involved. I think the first time I came across you, you were working for Demos, the think tank, and then you stood at the last election against Oliver Dowden at the age of
20. Well, I'm now 27. I was 26 in July. Yeah,
which is quite young to stand as a candidate.
It was, but I think it's important that we have more.
Did you enjoy it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, look, I love campaigning. Really, speaking to people, hearing the stories that you don't hear in the media on a day-to-day basis, and their concerns. I think it's really humbling. It's really grounding, and it motivates you to keep going. That you want to get elected.
Okay. Well, we also have with us Ben Lake, Plaid Cymru MP, Baroness Claire Fox, Josh. We've already done Josh. Richard Holden, the Conservative MP for Basildon and Billericay, former Conservative Party chairman. Right, a WhatsApp question from Robbie in Chelmsford. If the Chancellor raises fuel duty as expected in her budget tomorrow while making buses 50% more expensive, then doesn't this call into question the government's support for working people, public services and the environment all at once? I do think this, and I supported them in July. Robbie is a regular caller, and he was a Conservative voter who was going to vote Liberal Democrat but ended up voting Labour, I think I'm right in saying. Richard Holden, let's come to you first.
Well, Robbie in Chelmsford, I think, has hit the nail on the head. And bizarrely, actually, Chelmsford is where I launched the extension of the Get Around for £2 bus fare scheme.
Because you were Roads Minister.
When I was Roads Minister, yeah. And actually, in that area, particularly important for, as I represent Basildon and Billericay, I've got constituents from Billericay who, on day release from, say, a their apprenticeship schemes will go to Chelmsford to do certain college courses. I remember speaking to Vicky Ford, former MP for Chelmsford at the time, who a lot of her constituents worked at Stansted Airport in relatively low-paid jobs. It would cost them a fortune to get the old bus out there. When we knocked it down to the £2 scheme, it was literally like giving them a £10 a day pay rise, because it's cash straight out of their take-home pay. And
I thought Conservatives believed in free markets.
No, well, I think there is a free market. We do believe in free markets, but I think I think this is the key thing about this £2 scheme. It really benefited lower-paid workers who are often travelling distance, not just a short distance around the town, but if you're travelling, say, between Basildon and Southend, or Chelmsford and Billericay, or Chelmsford and Stansted, and it also helped people who were, as I said, people like students who might be travelling longer distance to different college courses from the one in their nearest town. And the other people it really helped were, you might not be aware of this, but your free bus pass only kicks in at 9:30 in the morning for a lot of the country. So if you're going to an early doctor's appointment, actually for a lot of people on pensions, also a huge benefit as well. Now, it was one of those things which I thought ticked a lot of boxes, and we worked with a lot with DWP on it, because obviously for a lot of people who are unemployed, one of the big steps is access to jobs. If you're not got a car, then it's very expensive to travel by bus or train as well. If you've got a train station nearby, actually having a low-cost bus option was really important. So, that and the fact that fuel duty is also going up is like, or looks like it might be going up. It feels like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't at the moment.
But would a Tory government have continued this scheme, though? Because Keir Starmer seems to be suggesting that they hadn't found sustainable funding to keep it going.
Well, we've been very clear, and I fought very hard to get in the manifesto that we'd have kept the £2 bus fare scheme all the way. I was literally, the last couple of days, been texting the former head of the policy unit at Downing Street under the last government about the £2 bus fare scheme, a chap called James Nation. We were literally talking about it and how it was such a shame that Labour hadn't seen the upside of this scheme and the broader benefits it has, and had decided to go for it rather than protecting it, because it is. Also, in terms of spending, you're talking of, I think when we started, it was around £250 to £300 million a year to do this. That might seem like a gargantuan quantity of money. In the terms of the broader government spending package, it isn't the most expensive scheme going, and especially when you think of the side benefits, particularly around employment, actually. And the real challenge we have with getting people off welfare and back into work, actually you can see it as a scheme on the other side. So, look, I'm very much with Robbie in Chelmsford on this. I think there's also broader issues coming, which have been highlighted already, like the national insurance rise, a jobs tax, which really could be hitting people, particularly the self-employed tomorrow. We know that businesses are very concerned about that. We know that if taxes on hiring people are higher, then they'll hire fewer people. I mean, it's just totally logical. And again, it's something which I don't quite understand why the government's going in these places, and we don't really also know on the flip side what they're going to do with the money which they're looking quite clearly to raise right across the piece at the moment.
Well, of course, you can hear full coverage of the budget on LBC all day tomorrow. Sheila Fogarty will be covering it live on her programme, and on our programme tomorrow night we will have Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Ben Lake.
Yes, well, very much like Richard, actually, I agree with Robbie. I represent an area that is very rural, and actually one of the biggest problems we've had for quite some years now is the lack of public transport. We have two train lines coming, one into the north and one into the south. It's not connected, but buses used to be the main mode of public transport for most of the rural villages and towns that I represent. And in recent years, we've seen cutbacks to the point where if you live in any of the villages or towns that are not the main sort of market towns, you don't have a bus service worthy of the name. And whether that's trying to get hospital appointments, to education, to work, you name it, you just haven't got that option. And so the concern that I have is that people now have had to find ways of getting to all these important functions of life, usually dependent on private car transport, whether that's hitching a lift with somebody else or indeed running their own car, on wages that they don't really have, only to be told now that the fuel duty might go up. I know it's speculation at the moment, but some reports suggest that it could be as much as 7 pence per litre. Now, that would be devastating for many rural areas, not just the ones that I represent, but across the country, because quite simply the investment hasn't been there for.
Let me play. I kind of agree with you, but I'll play the devil's advocate because that's my job. Given that petrol and diesel prices have come down by 10 to 20 pence over the last year or so, I mean, there is a bit of space there. And if you're a government that needs to raise a hell of a lot of money, putting up by 7 pence would raise about £6 billion, I'm told. I mean, that would be a less painful way of doing it than some of the other things that they've chosen, wouldn't it?
I think it's it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut in terms of the fact that it's completely indiscriminate. So there are areas of the country where perhaps actually car dependency isn't as high, and the hit to the wallet, if you like, won't be felt as acutely. But the reason why diesel and petrol prices have gone down is very much pegged with oil prices. Now that's beyond the government's control, and so although perhaps we've seen prices drop in recent weeks, there's nothing to say that, especially given the geopolitical situation in the Middle East specifically, you might see that increase. Now, if they then also unfreeze the fuel duty, you'll then have a situation where not only has it gone up 7 pence per litre, and then whatever else the underlying oil price, crude oil price is pushing it. So I would have a lot more sympathy with the government if they were also serious about investing in public transport in rural areas. Now, to date, despite all the speculation and all the trailing we've had in advance of this budget, there seems to be very little about rural public transport. And so the point I will be making, if these reports come to pass tomorrow, is that you are punishing rural constituents of mine in particular because you have not been investing in public transport alternatives for them. They have therefore been dependent.
Well, they've only been in power for 3 months.
That's fair enough, but in Wales, of course, the Labour Party have been in power for
true, yes.
Nearly as long as I've been on this planet. And so, forgive me, I shouldn't conflate the two, but they haven't been investing in rural public transport in a way. And if they did, then perhaps we'd have a bit more sympathy with their plans.
Josh Tapper, this is where you earn your safe seat selection at the next election. The floor is yours.
No, look, I mean, we'll obviously have to wait till tomorrow to see the full package, because I think it is really important to see things in the round. Obviously, we have been getting a bit of, drip feeding, quite a bit of it, but we don't know everything that's going to be in there tomorrow. So I think that's really important. But what we do know is that difficult decisions will have to be made, and maybe they wouldn't have had to have been made to this extent if the country's finances weren't left in such a dire state, for a number of reasons. Obviously Conservative mismanagement, but also a number of shocks over the last few years. There will be difficult decisions. That will, of course, mean raising the tax burden, especially on those with the broadest shoulders. But
all they seem to be doing at the moment is raising taxes or fares for people who don't have the broadest shoulders, in the winter fuel allowance, and now this.
Well, what I would say is, look what they are going to be doing for working people. So we know what likely will be coming, is 500 million for more affordable homes. It's over £1 billion to expand government-funded childcare, more for the NHS to make sure that we bring down the NHS waiting lists. And so we've got 40,000 extra doctor's appointments a week. So and the announcement that came just before the show started around the national minimum wage. And by the way, raising it across the board, but also for those aged between 18 and 20 and apprentices by an even larger number, and I think that's really, really important as a former apprentice myself. But my point is yes, there will be difficult choices. We don't know exactly all of them and what will be coming, but the reason that they are doing that is so that they can meet the manifesto pledges that they put in on those missions and on those key things that people want to see investment in across the country. But it needs to come from somewhere. And what I'm yet to have seen so far is the Conservatives or the other parties say how they'd raise that money instead.
Corey's just messaged me to say this is all far too civilised, so come on, Claire Fox, shake it up a bit.
The most irritating thing about this discussion is Labour saying we're just doing this to live up to our manifesto pledges, as though it's a kind of set-in-stone list. And that's where the working people issue has driven me mad, as though we're all complete idiots. We're not going to damage working people by raising taxes for working people. Then they get into the definition question. But the truth is, ordinary working people across the board are going to suffer from this manifesto, from this budget, rather. And it's really interesting because I appreciate that it's tough times financially, but we get into a situation now where the government on the one hand says we're going to be all grown up and tell you seriously we've got to make these very hard choices, but we're not going to affect working people, we're going to stick with our manifesto pledges, and then they absolutely stick the boot in places that were not in the manifesto. The winter fuel allowance wasn't in the manifesto. The attack on travel, I mean, this is an attack on people's freedom to get about, whether it's the bus fares or whether it's actually your capacity to drive a car. This is an attack on ordinary people getting about. And then the NHS, I think Richard made a very important point there when he was saying about what's the money going to be spent on. Because one of the refreshing things about Wes Streeting was when he said the NHS needs reform. It doesn't just need more money. Then actually this morning on the media round, all I kept hearing people saying was we need this money in order to back up the NHS. And actually throwing money at the NHS, unless we're absolutely certain about how it's going to be spent, is actually throwing money after bad. And then on the minimum wage, this really is irritating. You know, oh, well, we're doing it for the ordinary people, so the minimum wage is going up. There's no point raising the minimum wage if then you're going to impoverish people in another breath over there. This is not the same as saying we need the money to invest in a dynamic economic growth that we heard so much about at the investment summit that suddenly now got forgotten. This is actually playing around with ordinary people's desires and aspirations, which is why they voted Labour. They knew it would be tight, but they're the ones who were suffering and on the receiving end of that. Is that lively enough?
That's very good. Do you want to respond, Josh?
Of course. No, look, I totally hear the point of, for me, trust in politics is the biggest issue. And
well, this is not helping, let's put it that way.
Look, you need whoever's in government, obviously Labour now, to stick to their word, to deliver for people. People need to be able to feel that they've had tangible changes in their lives, not just come the next election, but before that, right? And they need that tangible difference. That change isn't going to come overnight for working people, for anyone, but hopefully with the changes that will be announced in the budget tomorrow and the money that will be able to be raised for more investment, which will help in turn working people, that hopefully they can actually deliver on those things. It won't happen overnight, but you need to be thinking long term here. This is one budget, and I, for one, hope that a lot of these measures and tax rises that might be announced tomorrow won't stick around for a very long time. But measures need to happen in the immediate term to put our country in a better state and working people in a better position.
Right, more questions to come. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32. Let's get the latest LBC News headlines from Daryl Jackson.
The teenager accused of the murders of 3 girls in Southport this summer has now been charged with a terror offence. 18-year-old Axel Ruda-Cabana is also accused of producing the biological toxin ricin. The Chancellor has confirmed a rise in the minimum wage. It will go up for workers 21 and over in April to £12.21 an hour or £1,400 a year. A former US Air Force pilot has been cleared of kidnapping a young girl outside Harrods in West London. 57-year-old Robert Prusak was accused of approaching the girl after she became separated from her family while visiting from France in April 2022. LBC weather, light rain for southern Scotland tonight, patchy mist and fog developing overnight elsewhere, and a low of 6 degrees.
LBC
required.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
25 to 9, we have with us on the panel Conservative MP Richard Holden, Josh Tapper, who stood as a Labour candidate in the last election against Oliver Dowden, Baroness Claire Fox, and Ben Lake, the Plaid Cymru MP for Ceredigion. Have I pronounced that right?
Perfectly.
Now, just answer me this. Is the Lloyd George Museum in your constituency?
It isn't, but it's about the only piece of the western coastline that isn't.
Did you read the story in the Telegraph at the weekend about the fact that the Labour government want to decolonise it in some way and sort of introduce new exhibits? Because, of course, we did have an empire when Lloyd George was Prime Minister, so they've employed consultants to decolonise the Lloyd George Museum.
I wasn't aware of that. I didn't see that.
Well, you ought to look it up.
Yeah.
Outrageous. Anyway, we haven't got a question on that, but we do have a question on the American election, which, of course, will be taking place a week from today. Albert in Croydon says, does the panel think Donald Trump winning the election would be a bad thing for the world? And who would they prefer to win out of him or Kamala Harris? Ben Lake.
Well, I can't claim to be an expert on American politics, so what I'm about to say, take it with a pinch of salt. I've been very concerned about some of the positions that former President Trump has outlined, especially when it comes to his foreign policy. I think foremost amongst my concerns is approach to international law, and particularly the conflict in Ukraine. I appreciate that he has met with President Zelensky, and the post sort of meeting formalities were quite civil. Nevertheless, I am concerned that President Trump would give succor to Putin and push on even further in terms of his war of aggression, and also in that regard destabilise the rules-based international order, as imperfect as it is. It is probably the best thing we have, and I think we should look back at history and consider the anarchy that existed before 1939 and before the establishment of the United Nations, and the system does require some of the most powerful countries in the world, in this case the United States, to act as sort of the policeman. And I don't think that President Trump, if he were to be re-elected, is keen to perform that role. And that does then worry me. And I think, personally, that would be a bad thing for the world. So in terms of...
So one vote for Kamala?
I think so.
I suspect a second one coming up here, Josh.
Ian, this is the easiest question so far. Absolutely. Look, I am appalled by the idea that there's even a prospect of Donald Trump becoming president again. You have someone who refused to accept the result of a democratic election last time round and has incited hate, incited the insurrection on the Capitol. Quite frankly, I would love to see Kamala elected as the President of the United States, first and foremost for democracy. Also,
but isn't it an indictment? It's an indictment on President Biden and Kamala Harris that they're even level pegging at the moment. That, I mean, if Biden had done the decent thing a year ago, they could have selected maybe a much stronger candidate than Kamala Harris.
Oh, look, I think there's absolutely... The fact that Biden held on for so long is clearly put a hindrance. It means that they haven't gone through a proper primary process. It also means that since Kamala Harris has been selected, there hasn't been as much time for the American public to actually get to know her, and that probably does have an absolute impact, whereas Trump is a very recognisable figure. But I'm just hoping that the Democrats can turn voters out in big numbers on election day.
Claire Fox.
So let's put it this way. I think Kamala Harris would be an absolute disaster if she got elected. And that is not because I think that I want Trump to get elected. It's just to ensure that we understand there is something deeply anti-democratic going on when the Democrats' way of dealing with Trump is to describe a rally as being a fascist rally like the Nazis. All of the media went along with this as well. To promiscuously use the term fascist, I think is very, very dangerous. And one of the things that's never explained at any point is why millions and millions of people are considering voting for Donald Trump. There is a reason for that. They have been at the receiving end of the most severe measures in relation to the economy. They're fed up of, ironically, the identity politics that's being played. I've really found it distasteful that Kamala and her supporters have been going around appealing to black men and saying, you have got to prove that you are not selling out your race by voting for Trump. And in fact, every time they have that conversation, and Michelle Obama was one of them, more of them have said they're going to vote for Donald Trump as it goes, because the identity politics card that Kamala Harris is playing, and she's been totally underwhelming as a candidate. I think that she's unimpressive in all of the interviews I've seen, means that, and this is what's a disaster for me, that Trump is going to basically not have the kind of opposition he should have in a democratic election. I want him to be up against a formidable candidate where you could therefore see properly for once what he's made of politically, whereas that's not what's happened at all. And so before we just say Trump would be a disaster for the world, let's remember Kamala Harris's disastrous record. And by the way, as a prosecutor, before she was a very silent partner in the Biden disaster years, she was one of the people who was most harsh, most severe, and most draconian in how she dealt with black men and criminal justice. And so she can't kind of sweep in now as some kind of sweet, I'm on your side person and forget her record. And she didn't do anything in the Biden years. And it is a disgrace that she was brought to power with a coup. So as much as I can be absolutely outraged by the... Well,
did I miss something?
No, by the fact that there was no proper contest to get her, for the reasons you actually pointed out, Ian. Biden was actually kept in far too long.
She was voted for by Democratic delegates.
I know that everybody's gone over literal in a moment. I don't mean a real coup. I don't mean a real coup, because I do now know that could be clipped and then people will think I was saying there was a coup. But the nation, I believe that your listeners and viewers are more smart than that, and they know that's not what I meant.
More smart than me, that's what you're saying.
No, what I'm saying is that's not a gotcha that will work. What I mean is that there was not a process, and many Democrats in America feel this, by the way, where the best candidate took power because they wouldn't let Biden go, and then they kind of gaslit us. That really bit drove me mad, where they'd say, oh, what a brave, courageous thing that he stood down.
So you'd vote for Trump over Harris?
No, luckily I don't have to choose.
No, but if you did?
No, I probably wouldn't vote for either. There were candidates I'd consider. I probably wouldn't vote for either of them. I do, however, think that this narrative in the UK that doesn't understand why millions are going to vote for Trump...
Well, they didn't in 2016 either.
...shows a certain tone deafness. It doesn't show a lot of understanding of what's happening in America. And I also think means that people then go around turning Kamala Harris into some kind of saintly figure, which is completely misplaced.
Richard Holden.
Well, I think I'm going to do what some Americans do and take the fifth on the. Would I go for?
How very disappointing.
Would I go for?
You're normally not without
Kamala.
an opinion, Richard.
No, I know, but I think as somebody who's aspiring to get on the executive of the UK-US all-party parliamentary group, I think I need to be a little bit careful about it. But look, Claire's raised. I think actually there's a couple of things I want to say more broadly. Claire raises some really important points, and these are some which you can also translate across the Atlantic. Some people do not understand why millions and millions of people vote for Trump, and if you look at our media, sometimes that is, you really don't get an understanding of that at all. I am very glad, more broadly, I'm not involved in American politics, which I find incredibly divisive, incredibly polarising, and utterly dependent on money. And whereas our politics really isn't in the UK, and it allows Ben and I, despite having very substantial disagreements on certain issues, to also work together on issues where we do have things in common as well, which I think is a much better system overall. There are obviously concerns on all sides about this. What I would say, though, is that let's look at what Trump did when he was in office as well. There were some things like the big Abraham Accords initiative, exactly, which actually was incredibly positive on the foreign policy front. So I think to put it all on one side, there's also obviously stuff like some of the things he said during COVID, which were highly questionable. But to say it's all on one side of the ledger or another, I think it's just a bit cheap.
Josh, you haven't been out campaigning for Kamala. You weren't one of these Labour people that were asked to go and
I wasn't. If I could, I would have, though. I would have been delighted to. But look, I just wanted to, also add, if you want to understand the measure of the man and the character, you need to listen to the people that have worked closest with him. And when you hear what his former chief of staff, John Kelly, has said about the Hitler comparisons and how he admires some of the things that Hitler's done, and
but John Kelly's successor, Mick Mulvaney, was on, I think, the Andrew Marr programme, saying, well, he never heard him say anything like that at all. So it's sort of, it depends who you listen to, doesn't it?
All you need to look at is the vast number of people who used to work up at a very high level with Trump who are refusing to endorse him at this election. There is a reason for that, and that is because of his character.
Yeah, undoubtedly, there's huge question marks over Trump's character, and you rightly, Josh, pointed out that one of the greatest problems was the withdrawal of losers' consent at the end of the last election, for which I have nothing but contempt and which is a threat to democracy. I agree. He's not a man whose character I appreciate. However, I think that politics goes beyond that. There is a reason why millions of people want to vote for Trump, and the way that the opposition are dealing with him is to literally have headlines and to go around saying he's like Hitler, they are the Nazis. So that implies that the many millions of people who are considering voting for him are sheep-likely following into some Nazi dystopia, and that's not the way they feel at all. There is a lively civil society in America where this debate is going on, and they feel insulted that people are suggesting that they're fascists for considering voting for Donald Trump, and that the only virtuous thing you could do is to vote for
Kamala Harris has now called him a fascist.
What?
Kamala Harris has called him a fascist.
No, that's what I'm saying. So what they're saying is they are beyond you considering voting. Now, in a democracy, it's very important that the way that you slay your opponent, again, not being literal, listeners, is to do so through ideas, through politics, intellectually, to take on their policies and so on. Kamala Harris has had very few policies for which we could engage. I mean, it's hard to know what she stands for. And therefore, when the only thing that you get is this notion that this is the Nazi party lurking behind Donald Trump, that's actually a dangerous attack on democracy, because it denies the electorate the chance to have the politics out in the open.
Right, we will come to our fun question in a moment.
God.
It's a good one tonight. It's 8:47.
LBC Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
10 to 9. Interesting text here from Glenn, who says, Claire Fox proves that the far left and far right is a horseshoe. I think he means that as an insult.
Oh, yeah, he means, wasn't she once involved with living Marxism, and now doesn't she say that we should not automatically condemn Trump as a fascist, therefore I must be right-wing? But that all started when I was doing Brexit, you know, when I said it was Brexit, people said fascist. Do you know what I mean? You think, oh, for God's sake. Anyway, there we go.
Virtually every day hosting this programme. Right, we have Richard Holden with us as well, Conservative MP for Basildon and Billericay. Ben Lake is Plaid Cymru MP for Ceredigion. And Josh Tapper is a Labour activist and former candidate. Right, a text question here from Brian in Kings Lynn. Argentina's populist president says Britain's surrender of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, surrender was his word, not mine, although, makes him believe Argentina can now get the Falklands through negotiations too. Should the government regret this decision? Now, just by way of background to this, Javier Milei has told the Financial Times that the Falklands were never going to be Argentine again through conflict and disagreement. But given years of negotiations led to the Chagos decision, by that mechanism, we believe that in the long term, the Falklands will become Argentine again. Richard Holden.
Well, I'm glad that the Argentinian president has ruled out any form of conflict. I think that's a good step in the right direction, but I don't think so. The Falkland Islands have a pure right to self-determination. They've had a referendum recently in the last few years where I think 99.8% of them decided they wanted to remain with the UK. I am very worried, however, by the broader decision around the Chagos Islands for a couple of reasons. One, I really worry about and it's totally unclear about the actual people of the Chagos Islands and their involvement in any of the process there and their rights over it. And secondly, that broader concern that I have is that I'm not convinced, having seen the Foreign Secretary in Parliament, that the full implications, particularly of China's expansion into the Pacific, have been fully understood by this new government. Obviously, this has been a long-standing issue with Mauritius. But it really does concern me when you're seeing huge Chinese island building in the South China Sea. You're seeing deals with countries like Bangladesh. You're seeing really aggressive financial deals with countries like Sri Lanka. I am really worried that this is something where the full implications of this have not been thought through not just for the UK actually, but actually for that broader position we hold as one of the leading nations in the Western world, and that really does worry me as well.
Claire.
I actually thought when I heard this that this was an example of Milei. Is that how you say it?
Milei.
Well, yeah. Of like trolling the government, because actually when this was announced, everybody said to the Labour government, oh, you know what's going to happen next? It's going to be the Falklands. Yeah, it's going to be the Falklands. Argentina going to claim. And they said, don't be ridiculous. And then he says, well, actually. And so it's the least surprising thing that's ever happened in the world. But as it goes, well,
something for Liz Truss to disagree with him about.
No doubt. But I'm not making that point. I do think it's very important, though, that the Chagos Islands is not forgotten as a problem, but not in my instances for the surrender of giving it away, but because the Chagosian people were so badly served by it. And it really irritated me that there was this sort of hint of, oh, well, we are the decolonisers and we are allowing people. I mean, what absolute bunkum. I mean, this was a situation where self-determination for the Chagosian people was actually denied by the decision, and they were ignored and treated with total contempt. And when they tried to raise the issue, they were kind of like, no, we did talk to you. They said, no, you didn't. So I think that this was a naive act in relation to the Chagos Islands, and then it was actually dealt with very badly by effectively, again, I hate this way the government does this gaslighting, is they literally look you in the eye and say something, and you just go, that's not true. We've talked to the Chagosian people, that's not what they said. And then they carry on, and then they say, we're the virtuous people, because we're on the side of decolonisation.
There is a lot of virtue. Can I tell you, right? There's a lot of virtue signalling from this government when it comes to foreign affairs, and I think the Chagos Islands is a perfect example of it, especially the way they dealt with the Chagosian people. And you can see that more recently with this talk of reparations for slavery, which has also now been raised by the new government, totally ignoring Britain's role actually in ending the slave trade.
Well, to be fair, Keir Starmer's ruled it out and said he wouldn't apologise. They signed a treaty. The door has been opened in a way that it wasn't before. Well, they didn't sign a treaty. They signed an end of Commonwealth Summit communique.
They signed a communique, but it does sort of indicate certainly it feels like it indicates a change in position from the UK government in a way which is I think a bit of virtue signalling that we all know Keir Starmer's all in favour of, just like when he took the knee not that many years ago.
Ben.
Well, I would agree actually with the point that I think as far as the Chagos Islands is concerned, the fact that self-determination for the Chagosians was denied is the scandal. And as far as the Falkland Islands is concerned, I mean, I'm in favour of self-determination of people, and the Falklanders have made it very clear in a relatively recent referendum. And although I note that the Argentinian president has said this, it's a welcome change of tone, of course. He's not espousing military sort of conflict by way of regaining sovereignty over the islands. I do, however, think that we should take it with a pinch of salt. All Argentinian presidents have to talk about the Falklands for domestic purposes, if nothing else. So I don't think I'm too concerned. But as far as the Chagos Islands are concerned, the fact that the Chagosians themselves were denied self-determination.
Josh, if you're very quick, we can squeeze in one final question.
I don't claim to be an expert on the Chagos Islands.
Okay, that's enough.
But the government has said that sovereignty isn't up for negotiation in Falklands, and I agree with that.
Okay. Right. Kat in Leicester says, should fireworks only be allowed to be used in licensed areas, such as during organised public displays and at authorised private functions, which would require a paid-for licence? Now, one Labour backbencher, Sarah Owen, has launched a parliamentary bill to ban the sale of louder fireworks to members of the public because of concerns they're harmful to animals and also people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I think I've read somewhere Sainsbury's have actually stopped selling fireworks, so maybe there is some trend developing here. Right, 30 seconds each. Claire.
Joyless and Puritan, of course not, for God's sake. This is a government... don't encourage a government that would have you needing a licence for any amount of freedom. Don't give them any ideas. That's Josh? What I'd say.
There's long been questions about the impact of fireworks. I think there needs to be a conversation about it. I'm not sure this is the right way, but I don't think we should shut it down straight away.
I get a lot of correspondence from farmers, my constituency, who are concerned about this time of the year. So I'd be more than happy to have the discussion, the debate. How you actually implement a ban and what have you, I think, is open to question, and I'd be sceptical as to its efficacy.
Richard?
No, but I do think there is an issue with under 18s getting them, and I think that needs to be properly enforced.
That's different.
You're a wonderful
completely.
panel, all so brief. Thank you very much.
Can I just
indeed.
say, post-traumatic stress disorder is a very serious thing that does not come about from getting a few fireworks.
You have never met my little dog Woody, have you?
No, it is also true that little dog Woody is not the same as people getting post-traumatic stress disorder.
No, it's far worse.
And he, as a dog, does not get post-traumatic stress disorder. He just gets frightened by the noise.
He just gets traumatic while it's going on.
He doesn't like the noise, fair.
Right, a fun question, don't you, just Woody? Andrew in Cambridge says, after researchers in America found a lost Mayan city by accident, what's your best unexpected find? Ben?
My best unexpected find is, as a Chelsea fan,
Chelsea fan from Ceredigion.
They used to train back in the day when they weren't the fantastic team that they are now. But my unexpected find is that Enzo Maresca, the new coach, is a pretty decent coach and he's turning things around, so I'm over the moon.
Okay, Josh?
I'm not sure about unexpected find, but this hurts deeply because I had an unexpected loss today when I took £10 out of the ATM on the way to the dry cleaners and then lost it. It fell out my pocket. So that was quite...
Have you not heard of Apple Pay?
Honestly, and I barely carry cash around, which is why it's so frustrating. And my most unexpected find was probably, it's very lame. I started with a personal trainer recently and have got into skipping, and I found an old skipping rope at my parents' house.
I haven't done skipping yet. That's a delight to for
Better than
watching. Claire?
I think we can safely say that as somebody who was the publisher of Living Martyrdom, one of the most unexpected finds is finding myself in the House of Lords and being called Baroness. You can't get more unexpected than that. So I find myself daily thinking, what am I doing here? Let alone what the nation thinks, what's she doing there? But anyway, it's quite good fun.
So, well, bizarrely, so my dad's actually a part-time antique dealer in his retirement, and he actually, so it's not a find that I found, but it's something that he found for me, and obviously I've been interested in politics for a long time. And he was doing a house clearance a few years ago and found a poster advertising the 1852 election in Clitheroe, which is the nearest town to where I grew up. I later did a bit of digging and found out that that election which was run was countermanded due to bribery and corruption, and then the subsequent by-election was also countermanded due to treating of the electorate. So I think that has always stood me just to remind me that, you should never take the electorate for granted and always follow the rules.
What's your majority?
20.
Exactly. So you will never take the electorate for granted.
Absolutely never, no.
Thank you to all four of you for coming on the programme tonight. Now, tomorrow's budget special cross-question panel includes the luxury hotelier Sir Rocco Forte, Independent MP and former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, the Conservative Shadow Education Secretary Damien Hines, and Bloomberg's Head of Economics Stephanie Flanders. What a panel for you tomorrow night, ladies and gentlemen. Now, coming up in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, because a week today, Americans will be going to the polls. Apparently millions of them have done already in early voting. Maybe we should have that here. Well, last night, Donald Trump appeared at a campaign rally in the city of Atlanta, and he's hit back at the claims of his opponent that he's a fascist. He says, "I am not a Nazi, she's a fascist." Is this really what we've got to look forward to over the next week? Is that the level of discourse two American presidential candidates have? Bring back Barack Obama and John McCain. Halcyon days, hey? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom,